Hi, welcome to Flight Test. I'm Andres, and today I'm going to show you how to build the FT Edge. Alright, so we're going to start out with this piece here and remove all the tabs. Now we're going to remove the foam from all these channels. Trace over these score cuts again with the razor blade, and just make sure not to cut through the backside of the paper. Now we're going to fold up these outside pieces, and it's going to be a B-fold as indicated on this piece. So let's just apply glue favoring the side of the bottom piece, and go ahead and do a B-fold, which means that the outer flap will come up beside the bottom piece. And just hold it there until it dries. Now if there's any excess glue that you need to get rid of, just go ahead and take a scrap piece of foam and scrape it away. Now let's do the same thing on the other side. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and install a couple of Velcro straps in this frame. This is optional, but it will help the battery stay in during more extreme maneuvers. We're going to take our popsicle stick and cut it so it fits in between this tab and this tab. Alright, now that we have our two popsicle sticks cut, we're going to go ahead and glue them so that they're laying in between the two tabs that we specified before. So that's how we want them positioned. Now we can go ahead and flip this piece back over, use a couple Flite Test straps, stick it through the tab and pull it out the other side so that we have this loop on top. Now we can thread this back through the bottom and loop it back around. Let's do the same thing for the second strap. On this big piece here, you can see that there's tabs labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That's where our formers labeled accordingly are going to go. Next, you'll need the pieces labeled 1, 2, and also the two pieces that are labeled with arrows. Alright, let's move the tabs from the pieces labeled 1 and 2. Now we're going to take these two pieces labeled with the arrows and just crush down these tabs so that they'll be easier to insert later on. And let's go ahead and do the same thing with the tabs on pieces 1 and 2. We're going to use these pieces labeled with the arrows first. The arrow is going to indicate the forward direction of the plane, so the arrow will be pointing forward, and the arrow will be close to this bottom surface on this piece. We can go ahead and glue these pieces down, making sure that the arrow is pointing in the correct direction. And wipe off any excess glue if you need to. Now let's take former number 1 and put a bead of glue on the underside next to the tab, and on the front side on either side of these cutouts. And we're going to take this and insert it into the tab labeled 1 on the other side and rock that forward so that the tabs on the two pieces we just installed fit. Now these formers 1 through 5 are labeled on the other side because in order to cut out the score cuts, the laser has to be etching on this side of the foam. So you don't get the labels on the underside, but you can reference them on the top if you need to. Now let's do the same thing with former number 2. Let's put these into the appropriate tabs and rock it forward to notch into the two tabs in front. Next, we need the formers labeled 3, 4, and 5, and we also need this piece that is labeled 3, 4, and 5. Let's go ahead and pop out the tabs on these formers, and this tab on number 4. Now we're going to take former number 4 and do a C-fold, which means we're going to fold it over on itself. Now we're going to take these tabs and squeeze them down again so that it will be easier to insert them later. We're going to start with form number 3 and take this piece, which is labeled 3, at one side, and we're going to insert this tab and glue that down. Now we want to make sure that these other tabs here are pointing this way, so not towards the angled side of former number 3, but away from it. That way, our other formers 4 and 5 will be able to slide in just like so, and they will all be facing the same direction. So we're going to go ahead and apply a bead of glue to this piece on the side that says 3, and go ahead and glue that in, of course making sure it's pointing in the right direction. Now that we've glued former 3, we can actually just leave formers 4 and 5 in as a friction fit because they'll be held in place by the airframe. Now let's go ahead and glue this in. We're just going to apply glue to everywhere that there's not a tab. Now we're going to need the piece labeled B1. That stands for bottom one. Remove these two pieces of foam right here, and we'll go ahead and fold that paper over. Use the table as our friend to rock this over. There should be a bead of glue leaking out, which is good. And let's go ahead and fold that over again onto the table so that we end up with this. Now let's remove all these foam tabs in this piece. I'm going to use a flathead screwdriver, and that should make it pretty simple. And just make sure not to cut through the backside of the paper. Now let's take a barbecue skewer and run the tip through these score cuts. Now we're going to fold this over along those score cuts. So just rest the palm of your hand against the outside and bend the foam. We're going to bend them a bit past what we need them to. We need each one of these creases to go to 45 degrees. So we're just going to bend them a bit past that. Now let's bring back our main piece here and just make sure that all the tabs are squished down. We're going to go ahead and do a test fit of this piece. And we're just going to want to align these 3 tabs with these 3 tabs right here. All right. Now that we've done test fit, we're going to go ahead and apply a bead of glue on the front half of former number 4. These pieces right here. And essentially anywhere on the top surface that there isn't a tab. Let's go ahead and line the tabs up. And just hold that down until it dries. Next, we're going to test fit the sides. You'll see that there's 2 tabs sticking out of the sides of the big piece and 2 tabs that we dug out here. Now let's just form this around the formers, and those tabs just pop right in. For this part, we're going to want to have a piece of scrap foam handy, and let's apply some glue to the front half of former 4, the other formers in between, and all over the side of this piece, over the whole length of the piece we're wrapping up. We're also going to want to apply glue in these score cuts right here. You don't need a lot, but it will add some structural rigidity. And we can just squeegee the rest off. Now let's do this again and pop in those tabs on the side. And just hold that on the table until it dries. And let's do the same thing on the other side. Next, let's grab the piece labeled B2 and let's do the same thing. Now we need this piece and the right angle gauge, and we're going to go ahead and remove all the tabs. We're going to leave these 2 tabs in. That's just going to make building this part of the fuselage a bit easier. Now we're going to do a B-fold on these 2 sides. Let's go ahead and apply a bead of glue, favoring the side of the bottom plate. And rock this up. And we can use the included right angle gauge to make sure that this is nice at 90 degrees. And let's do the same thing on the other side. Okay, now that that's done, we're going to test fit the top by just rocking this over. So this will also be a B-fold on the top. Now we can go ahead and apply glue on the top plate, favoring the sides. And go ahead and do the same thing that we did before. And roll that over in place. Now we can attach this piece to the rest of our fuselage. Let's test fit this by just sliding this in, making sure that the tabs are on the top and the bottom is nice and flush. All right, well, that looks good, so let's glue it in. We'll apply glue on these side plates. Around this piece right here, where they will be connected, and on this bottom piece right here. And let's go ahead and slide that in just as we did before. We can lay this on the table so that it's nice and flat on the bottom. Now we need this piece, which will be our turtle deck. Let's go ahead and remove the foam from the sides. For this piece, we're also going to remove the paper, but only on the inside, not the outside. Now we can take this piece to the edge of the table and use the table to help us roll it into shape. So this is lined up in the center, and carefully bend it over and roll it along the edge of the table to form it. Now we'll need these three pieces to help us install our turtle deck, and let's go ahead and pop out the tabs. Do a C-fold on both of these formers. Just apply glue on one side and fold it over. Now we can install these former pieces. Let's start with the smaller one. Just apply a couple beads of glue next to the tabs, and we can insert this into the tab right here. For this larger former, we're going to want to use this triangle piece here in order to keep it upright at a 90-degree angle. So let's go ahead and squeeze those tabs together and apply glue to the shorter side, which is the side that we're going to glue onto the former. Now let's go ahead and glue this on the plane. This is going to fit right into here. Let's apply a bead of glue next to the tabs and go ahead and put that in. Now let's come back to our turtle deck piece. We'll take one side of it, and what we're going to do is just put a bead of glue along the outer edge and install it on one side. Now when we put the bead of glue on, we're going to put this onto the table, and using the table as our friend, get that to be a nice flat surface. Just move this around a little bit on the table so that it doesn't glue itself down. When you install this piece, you want to make sure that the front of the turtle deck is flush with the front of this surface right here. So now we're going to glue the other side of the turtle deck, but before we do, let's go ahead and do a test fit. So what we're going to do is just rock this over, and it should sit flush with the other side of the turtle deck. You can kind of feel it, and you can even kind of hear it click when you roll it over. Put some glue on the two formers themselves. Don't need too much, but just to keep it in place. And a bead where the flap of paper is. Alright, let's go ahead and roll it over. Now we're going to move on to the tail. And to prep the fuselage, we're going to need to cut out this excess foam in here. So the paper around the turtle deck is already cut, but we just need to take a knife and cut out the rest of that foam. Also, the two tabs that we didn't cut out of the fuselage earlier, the one right here and the one on the bottom here, we're going to need to cut those out. Now we're going to need these two pieces for our tail. Let's go ahead and open the scores up. And we're just going to do a single bevel on the rudder side. If you're scratch building this plane, make sure that you bevel the rudder on the plane's left side. So once we've done that, let's go ahead, take a bead of glue, very thin bead of glue, run it over this hinge, grab a scrap piece of foam, and squeegee as much of that off as you can. Now we're going to do the same thing with the elevator, but this time we're actually going to do a double bevel to get more throw. This means that we bevel on the elevator side and the horizontal stabilizer side. Now as you can see, the double bevel gets us a lot more throw on the elevator. Now we're going to go ahead and reinforce our elevator. Now if you have the Speedbolt kit, you'll see that you have this piece in your plywood plank. If you don't have the Speedbolt kit, we'll show you how to reinforce the elevator with a popsicle stick. Alright, so we're going to take this piece and make sure that the slot for the control horn is on the same side as the cutout for the control horn on the elevator. And we can go ahead and glue this in. Just going to line up the back edges of this piece with the back edge of the elevator. Later, when we go to put our control horns in, this will just fit into this slot right here. Now, if you don't have the speedboat kit and you don't have this piece, you can go ahead and glue on a popsicle stick now, and make sure you glue it on the top of the elevator so that it doesn't run into the control horn on the bottom. Now let's install our horizontal stabilizer onto the fuselage. Let's go ahead and slide our elevator in, making sure that the hinge is on the bottom so the top is nice and pretty. And just slide that in all the way. Make sure that the elevator hinge is perpendicular to the rest of the fuselage. To reinforce our horizontal stabilizer, we're going to use a couple of popsicle sticks. And as you can see, there are 2 slots on either side of the fuselage. We're just going to stick this through, like so. Just make sure that it fits well before we glue it. Alright, now that we've checked for the fit, apply glue on half of the popsicle stick and half of the horizontal stabilizer. Now put the side of the popsicle stick with the hot glue through first, and then push out the other end about halfway. Doing it this way ensures that there's no hot glue spillover on either side of the popsicle stick. Remember, when you're gluing in the horizontal stabilizer, also make sure that it's flat relative to the rest of the fuselage. Okay, now that our popsicle sticks are in, we can go ahead with a bead of glue over the joints on the outside. Have a scrap piece of foam handy and squeegee that in. Let's test fit our rudder, and to do so, let's just crimp down this leading edge so I can slide in nice and easy. You can start at the bottom here and rotate up. Just slide that in as far as it'll go. You'll have about a 1/4 inch or so left of vertical stabilizer behind your fuselage. When you're test fitting the rudder, make sure that the bottom of the fuselage is flush with the bottom of the rudder. Now that we're happy with our rudder fit, let's just go ahead and glue the seams on the outside, which will be plenty to keep the rudder in place. We're going to do this for all the seams, including the 2 back here and on top, as well as on the bottom. Now I'm going to show you how to build the optional tail wheel. If you don't plan on installing a tail wheel, you can skip ahead in the build video. First, we're going to need this plywood piece right here. Glue it on the side of the rudder that does not have the bevel, and glue it on so that the front part lines right up with the rudder hinge, and the control horn slot right here sits right above the control horn slot in the rudder. And glue it on so that the front part lines right up with the rudder hinge, and the control horn slot right here sits right above the control horn slot in the rudder. Let's take our landing gear wire and bend it twice 90 degrees to match the shape. When you're bending this wire, make sure that you mark the bending point a little bit short of where the wire is supposed to come out, because this curve that forms the wire will extend the wire a little bit past your marked point. Now that we have our 2 bends, make sure that these 2 wire pieces are parallel. If they're not, just take your pliers and twist them so that they are. Now we can test fit this wire into the plywood piece and make sure it fits. Next, we're going to take this wire and bend it 45 degrees, about 1.5 inches from the last bend. Now we're going to mark this wire 1 inch from the bend we just made and bend it 90 degrees so that when it's attached, it's pointed towards the rudder. Now we can slide our wheel on and cut the wire, leaving about 1/4 inch protruding out from the wheel. There we go. Now let's take our tail wheel setup and put a dab of hot glue on the end to keep our wheel in place. As the glue is drying, if it drips towards the wheel, just spin the wheel a bit so that it doesn't get stuck. It can also help to rotate the tail wheel assembly as the glue is drying so that the glue doesn't limp over to one side. Now we're going to glue this into the plane. Now we can put the tail wheel assembly back on the rudder, and I'm just hanging this off the table so that the tail wheel isn't interfering with the build table. Now we're also going to take our control horn and put it in this slot right here. Once we've made sure that fits, we can go ahead and put a bead of glue in the control horn slot and slide the control horn in. Make sure you clear out all the excess glue from this piece because it will interfere with the piece we're putting on top. Now let's test fit this piece, which will act as a cover over this piece and keep our tail wheel assembly in. Now apply glue evenly to the bottom piece and put the top piece on with some firm pressure. That concludes the optional tail wheel step. Now I'm going to show you how to build the tail skid. We're just going to make this about 3.5 inches long. Let's go ahead and glue this in, just with a bead of glue. Now when we're gluing this in, I'm going to make sure that it's not sticking too far in, or else it'll get in the way of this servo right here. It doesn't matter if you're using an optional tail wheel or the tail skid, the rest of the build is going to be the same. Let's go ahead and install our tail servos. We don't need to make sure they're centered right now because we'll still have access to them later. Before we install these servos, we're going to need to get some extensions. These are about 10-inch extensions, and they should be enough for this plane. To keep these servo extensions from falling off, I like to just take a dab of hot glue and put it right on the connection. Now to install these, we're going to need to run the extension in first and just let gravity pull that down. If you get it just right, it should fall out the front of the hatch. Now we can go ahead and lift the servo up and apply a bead of glue on either side of the servo under the tabs. And just seat that servo down. For this build, we're just using the normal 9-gram servos, but if you want some extra performance out of this plane, you can use the Metal Gear servos that we sell on our store. You will, however, need to cut out the servo holes a little bit longer for the Metal Gear servos to fit. Now let's grab this piece, which we'll mount the motor to. Now let's fold this up as an A-fold as indicated. Now let's go ahead and glue on our motor mount to this pod. We're going to make sure that it's on the right side. If it's not on the right side, it won't sit flush with the top. As you can see, these motor mounts are actually off-centered. The holes are slightly shifted downwards. So just make sure that these two holes up here are on the same side as this top plate. Now let's go ahead with some hot glue and just reinforce this joint from the inside. Let's go ahead and grab a scrap piece of foam and squeegee that in. Now let's grab some packing tape and reinforce this motor mount. Just wrap the tape around the sides, and if there's any sticking up at the top, just slice it at the corners and fold it over on the top. One thing to note, if your motor has a shaft sticking out of the back, you're going to want to cut out this piece of tape right here so that the shaft can poke through. If not, then you can leave the tape where it is and you don't have to worry about it. Let's put this aside and grab this piece. Let's pop out these tabs, squish down these tabs so that they'll be easier to insert. Now this former is going to go into these two tabs right here. So let's slide that down, and those should fit just like so. Alright, let's go ahead and glue that in. We're just going to put a dab of glue on either side of the tabs, and a bead of glue on the outside of this fuselage wall. Just make sure that that's straight with your right angle gauge. Okay, let's test fit this motor pod. Just key it into the front of this former and rock it into place. Let's go ahead and glue this in. We're going to want to put glue on either side of the tabs on the bottom. And the back of this top plate here. Now we can go ahead and slap the motor and ESC in. One thing I've done here, I've actually spliced a separate BEC into my power leads on the ESC. This is just because sometimes when you're doing more aggressive 3D maneuvers and you're really using all the servos, it could draw too many amps on the integrated BEC in the ESC. So in order to keep the ESC from overheating, I'm using a separate BEC. Now this is optional, and you can fly with the BEC that's already in your ESC, but just watch out if you're flying too aggressively. Just let it cool down every minute or so. If you are using a separate BEC like in this build, go ahead and take a knife and just pop out the red wire, which is going to be the power wire from your ESC. That way you don't get two separate power inputs into the same receiver. Now let's install the motor. We're going to need 4 motor screws, and we're simply going to screw this into the motor mount. This is our new radial CPAC motor, but our regular CPAC motor will work just as well. We're going to go ahead and install the ESC on the side of the motor pod so that it gets nice cooling and gets a lot of airflow. Stick our servo wires and BEC through this slot right here. as well as our battery connector. And we'll grab some double-sided tape and attach that to the side of the motor pod. Okay, now we can thread the motor wires through the slot right here and connect them so we can test our motor direction. We're going to set this up to test our motor direction. So let's go ahead and plug our ESC into throttle. And we can plug our BEC, if you're using one, into any of the ports. Alright, now let's test our motor direction. So let's just power this up here. We're just going to give it a little bit of throttle. Alright, so I felt the motor bell with my fingers, and it's going in the right direction, which looking from the front is counterclockwise. Now if it's going in the wrong direction, spinning clockwise from the front, simply swap two of these motor to ESC connections and it'll be spinning in the right direction. For this next step, we're going to need our nose piece. And now we're going to remove all these foam tabs around the edges. Make sure that these slots are all cleared. Next, let's grab a scrap piece of foam and fold over all of these paper tabs. Now we're only going to do this on the front, and we're going to leave everything on this back edge free. Apply bead of glue. Use your scrap of foam to fold it over 90 degrees, wait a few seconds, and then fold it over again. Repeat the same step on all of the tabs on the front. Now that we have all the tabs in the front glued down, let's go ahead and take a barbecue skewer and run it through each of these score cuts. Now let's go ahead and bend these creases. The angle you'll be wanting to get from these creases are 30 in the middle two, about 60 in the outer two right next to them, and then 45 for all the other creases. Lay one side flat on the table and use our other hand to rotate them up. Now let's go ahead and test fit this and just wrap it around. And we're only going to focus on connecting this back portion right here. So there's a tab on one side, and just connect them like so. As you can see, if we do that, there's going to be a space in between these two pieces. So to avoid that, we're going to go ahead and make a bevel on one of the sides. And that should be enough so that when we connect these two pieces, there's no more gap. Let's go ahead and connect these two pieces by just applying a bead of glue to this paper tab and doing the same thing as we did before while test fitting. Just make sure that the back edge lines up flush. If the paper tab didn't fold over completely, we can go ahead and add a smaller bead of glue and glue that down. Okay, now we're ready to test fit this on the fuselage. First, fold out all these little paper tabs so that they don't get caught on the nose while we're sliding this piece on. To test fit this on our airframe, we're going to go ahead and slide this on to the front, and we can squeeze this down a bit to widen the cheeks if we need to. And we're going to make sure that this lip is fitting over this former here. Okay, now let's pull this back off, and we're going to add a bead of glue in each one of these creases. Slide this on, but not gluing it to the airframe yet, and just hold it in place so that the glue dries in the creases and makes this a more solid piece. After you apply the glue, just take a scrap piece of foam and squeegee it into the crease. Alright, so let's slide this onto the airframe, making sure that this lip is on top of the former, and we can make sure that the side cheeks are flush with the side cheeks of the fuselage with our hands, and also feel that this piece is flush with the bottom with our fingers. Just kind of hold that there until it dries, about 60 seconds, because you want this piece to be nice and solid. Now that our glue is dry, let's go ahead and glue this flap down. Now this is important. We're not going to actually apply glue between this former and this bottom lip here, because after we glue down this flap, we need to rotate this nose piece up to apply glue to the other surfaces. So we're only going to apply glue to this paper tab right here. And use a scrap piece of foam to make sure that paper tab is nice and flush. Now that this flap is glued down, let's go ahead and rotate this nose piece up, and we can flip the plane over. Okay, let's go ahead and apply a bead of glue to this outer ring here, and on this bit of the side cheeks where we can get to them. And let's rotate this nose piece back in. If there's any glue that squeezes out under the tabs, don't worry about it. Just fold the tabs over with a scrap piece of foam so that the tabs will be glued down. For the tabs that didn't have any glue seeping out, we can go ahead and just apply bead glue and fold those over as well. Now we can go around back to the top and seal these flaps down as well. Alright, now we're going to seal the rest of the nose up. So let's flip this over again and take a look at these seams right here. You can see when we fold this piece over that there's going to be a gap. So what we can do is take a razor blade and bevel one side. That way when we fold it over, the paper will be nice and flush on the outside. So to do this, let's just go ahead and apply a bead of glue in each of these creases right here and squeegee it off, as well as a bead of glue around the outside edges. Let's flip it over to the top. And we're going to do the same thing, but with these top flaps. So we can go ahead and fold this open, and again, we're going to need to bevel this side. This will be a bit of a sharper bevel than before. Okay, if we're happy with the fit, apply a bead of glue around the outside edges. And go ahead and secure that down. Now let's move on to our hatch. We're going to need the pieces labeled T1 and T2 for top 1 and top 2. Okay, now let's go ahead and glue these paper tabs over. And now let's do a B-fold on this piece as indicated. Let's put this piece aside and move on to piece T1. Let's remove all the foam tabs on the outside and around this former here. Now let's go ahead and glue these paper tabs down as well. Now let's go ahead and open up all these score cuts with our barbecue skewer. Now these score cuts on the outside will have to be about 60 degrees, so we're going to score them even deeper with the barbecue skewer. Now let's flip this around and open up the back pieces. We're going to need to do a little bevel cut on these pieces right here. So we can just open this up to about 90 degrees, take our razor blade, and just shave off that bit of foam. This will make sure we have a nice clean 90-degree angle on the outside. Okay, now let's go ahead and form this piece by putting the top plate down on the table and rotating the rest of it up. Since these side plates are so thin, we can go ahead and take a ruler and support it in the back so that they don't crease. We're going to want to bend this outside flap in past 60 degrees relative to this flap so that when we form it to 60 degrees later, it'll be easier. Alright, test fit this. So just roll these pieces up and fold it over onto the former in the front. Okay, now that we've practiced that motion, let's go ahead and apply a bead of glue into each one of these creases and have a scrap piece of foam ready so that we can squeegee it in the creases. And do the same motion of rolling and bringing it up to the former. We're going to focus on keeping these side plates parallel with the former on the bottom and also parallel to each other on top. Now we can take this former back out and apply a bead of glue around the outside to glue it in. If there's any paper sticking out, we can go ahead and cut that off with a razor blade. Now let's move on to the back. Going to bend this up slightly, a little past where it needs to go, so that when we rotate it up, it'll be nice and solid. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put glue into each one of these creases, squeegee that in, and then hold this shape while rotating it up so that this shape matches the shape up here. Alright, so let's just hold this in place Make sure that the shapes match. Also make sure that if you're looking from the back, these angles are at 90 degrees. So now we're actually not going to glue this seam yet. We're going to attach piece T2 to T1 like so. Apply bead glue around the front lip of piece T2. Attach those so that the sides and the top are flush. You'll notice that this piece isn't actually sitting completely flush on the table because there is an angle in that piece. Trace over it with a bead of hot glue on the inside. With a scrap piece of foam, squeeze that in. Okay, now we're ready to glue this seam right here. Crack this open and apply a bead of glue to one side. Now, we waited to do the seam so that we can lay this piece flat on the table. As you can see on piece T1, the larger piece, there's a flat area in the front, and on piece T2, there's a large flat area in the back. This way we can make sure that this piece is flat on the table, and that will make sure that this angle here is correct. Now we can go ahead and reinforce this seam as well with the same technique. For this next step, we're going to need these two pieces, which are going to be doublers for these side plates. These are going to fit right into here on the side, and the piece with the round part is going to be facing backwards towards the skinnier side of the hatch. Okay, now that we've test fitted that and the fit looks good, we can go ahead and apply glue to the inside of the side cheek. When you're gluing this in, just make sure that the profile of the airfoil lines up. Also, make sure that this piece back here is laying flush with the top surface of the hatch, and that this surface, as well as this one on both ends, are flush. Let's do the same thing on the other side. For this next part, we'll need the pieces labeled C1, C2, and the piece which is labeled C1 and C2. Let's go ahead and remove the foam tabs. Now we can take C1 and do a C fold. Alright, now we can take C1 and insert it into the slot in this piece, which is labeled C1. Just insert that all the way so that the top is flush. Now we can take C2 and this piece, apply glue at the back where it's labeled C2 and insert the tab to glue it on. Now let's insert this piece that we've constructed here into the tabs on the top of the hatch. Alright, now that we've test fit that, we can go ahead and apply glue on the bottom surface, skipping over the tabs. Glue it in place. Next, let's move on to constructing the rest of the canopy. And we'll need these three curvy pieces. Let's start out with the thinnest piece, which will be the piece at the back. And we can go ahead and peel off the paper just on one side. Now we can take this and bring it to the edge of the table and curl it so that makes a nice smooth curve. Now we can take this piece that we just bent and form it around these formers. It should be flush with this former back here, and it should cover up half of the former in the middle. It should also be flush on both sides. One thing to note, it is curved this way facing forward on the plane. We can go ahead and apply glue on the top of this piece, the top of both formers, a bead of glue on each of the sides. Now we can go ahead and hold that in place until it dries. Now we can move on to this piece, and let's repeat the same process. Alright, let's test fit this on the airframe. This piece should be flush with the piece we just installed, as well as with the top surface of the hatch. So this time we're going to apply glue on the top of this former, here on this former as well, and then a strip on each of the sides of this piece of the canopy. Don't worry too much about how bowed in this front piece is. Just make sure that both of the sides are flat. Let's move on to the next part of our canopy and repeat the process. This time, however, when we bend it on the edge of the table, we're going to rotate it as we bend so that this piece, the tip, is always at the edge of the table. So now that we've bent this piece, we can go ahead and use a razor blade to bevel the front of it so that we cut off all this excess foam. And this way, when we install it on the plane, it'll sit nice and flush with the rest of the hatch. All right, let's go ahead and apply some glue. We're going to need to glue on this top surface here around this piece. And we're going to apply a bead of glue around the bottom of this front piece. So line it up flush with the rest of the canopy and flush with the top surface of the hatch. Wipe off any excess glue if you need to. Next, let's grab a barbecue skewer, and we're going to take the hatch and poke through these two holes here. The barbecue skewer should come out underneath the top surface. All right, and now we're going to cut a couple pieces, about 2 inches long a piece, and glue them in the holes. To glue these in, just put a bead of glue inside the hole and insert the barbecue skewer. Leave about 1/4 inch of the skewer sticking out of the front. Don't worry if you get some spillover on the other side, because you won't see that anyways. Now let's bring back our main fuselage, and I did not secure this BEC down earlier, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm also going to install some extensions on these 2 wires so that the receiver can be placed farther back and it won't interfere with the placement of the wing. Okay, let's go ahead and take this opportunity to finish off the setup with our receiver. I've plugged in all our wires from the BEC, the ESC, and our 2 tail servos. And I'm just going to attach 2 extensions to the aileron port and the aux 1 port. If you don't have a 6-channel receiver, you can simply run a Y harness to your ailerons. Now let's go ahead and secure this receiver down. Just make sure you put it in between these 2 holes on the outside of the fuselage. That way it won't interfere with our barbecue skewers that we stick in later. We're just going to go ahead and secure these wires down with some glue so that they're not flopping around inside the airframe. Now let's get ready to test fit our hatch. And to do this, we're going to need to poke holes through this former. These holes are marked with pre-cut holes in this paper tab right here. So let's just go ahead and open those up. And now we should be able to slide in our hatch in the front with our skewers and then rock it backwards until it seats into the airframe. This might be a tight fit at first, but it'll get easier to work with over time. Make sure that this hatch fits flush at the back and at the front. Let's take a barbecue skewer and making sure that our hatch is firmly seated down. Poke a hole through the marked hole in the back, one side, and then flip this around and do it from the other side. Now let's lift our hatch back up. And we're going to take a couple of these wooden doublers in order to make this part stronger. If you're scratch building this at home, you can make these out of a bit of plastic gift cards and just drill a hole through the middle so it'll fit a barbecue skewer. Right, let's repeat the same process for the other side. All right, now put the hatch back on, put a barbecue skewer all the way through. And just leave about 1/4 inch sticking out on either side. Mark that point with your finger and go ahead and cut the barbecue skewer with a razor blade. Now that we're done with our fuselage, we can move on to the wings. First, let's open up the score cut for our aileron hinge and the score cut in the middle of the wing. If you bought the Speedbuild kit, you'll notice that one of these score cuts is already cut open. You don't want that to be the leading edge of your wing. The leading edge of your wing will be the score cut in the middle. So there's a pack of 5 score cuts here. The one in the middle is your leading edge. Go ahead and open that up. You can see that the back lines up with the aileron hinge. Now we can go ahead and do a double bevel on the leading edge. And now let's do a single bevel on the aileron. Now we can also pop out this tab for the aileron servo. Next, let's take a barbecue skewer and run it through all these score cuts. Now let's set this aside and move on to the wing spar. You can pop out all the foam tabs. Let's do an A fold on the spar as indicated. Now let's attach our spar to the wing. We're going to want to make sure that the end of the spar is flush with the end of the wing, and also that the sides of the spar are lined up with these two score cuts. Now let's fold this wing over and see how it fits. So when you fold it over, if you look from the side, you can see that the same part that we attached the spar to on the bottom, those two same score cuts will be lined up with the sides of the spar. Apply a bead of glue to each of these score cuts in the middle, not these two score cuts on the farther sides, and also not the bevel in the middle. We're just going to do this to reinforce the wing. Take a scrap piece of foam and squeegee that in. Now we can fold this over again, making sure that these score cuts in the middle line up with the sides of the spar. Now we can go ahead and glue this wing together. We'll need to apply glue to the leading edge and on top of the spar. Don't worry about the trailing edge for now. We'll deal with that later. Again, when the glue's drying, just make sure that the score cuts line up with the side of the spar and that you're pressing completely flat so that the two sides of the wing are parallel to each other. Okay, now let's move on to the trailing edge. The trailing edge should line up when we just press this together. Once we make sure that it does, all we need to do is apply a bead of glue on the inside of one of the sides of the trailing edge. We can go ahead and lay it on the table and make sure that we're contacting throughout the whole wing, not just at the ends, or else the middle might bulge up. And making sure that the trailing edge lines up at the top and the bottom throughout the whole wing. We could also go ahead and reinforce the aileron hinge the same way we did with the rudder and the elevator. Now we can move on to our servos. All we need to do is thread this servo wire through the hole until it comes out of the other end. Now I'm going to position the servo so that the servo arm will be more towards the rear of the plane so that this aileron linkage can be shorter. So I'm just going to apply a dab of glue on either end where the servo tab will be seated. We can take a piece of tape and take this servo wire, loop it through this small cutout here, and just tape it to the bottom of the wing. This will make joining the wings easier. This wing is now complete, so let's do the same exact process on the other wing. We have both our wings done now, so let's join them together. Grab a piece of packing tape, and we're only going to seal up this back little portion here. Make sure that the leading edges match up. Now we only did this little piece because if we did the whole thing, the wing wouldn't be able to open up nicely for us to put glue in. And we're going to apply glue just on one side, all around the airfoil, and also on the spar. Now when we join these wings together, the wings are actually thicker at the root and thinner at the tips. That means if we want a perfectly flat wing, we'll need to prop up the sides just a little bit. Now it happens that one piece of foam on either side under the wingtips is just right to ensure that the wing lays flat. Now that our wings are joined, let's go ahead and take some more packing tape and seal the rest of the seams off. Sounds great, doesn't it? If you have any tape sticking out the back, you can simply cut it down the middle and fold the pieces over. We also have optional Side-Force generators. You can use these, it'll improve the characteristics in knife edge a bit and improve yaw authority, but you don't need to. If you choose to use these, you're going to need to cut out a relief for the aileron at the tip. Or else, once you put these on, the aileron could rub on the Side-Force generator. I'm just going to line my ruler up about 1/8 of an inch from the wingtip, trim the aileron right about there. Now we can attach our Side-Force generators. Line up the leading edge with the tip of the Side-Force generator. You can see that I'm lining up the seam in the middle of the wing to this center line. We can also go ahead and put a bead of glue around the Side-Force generators and use a squeegee to squeeze that in order to reinforce it. Now let's go ahead and mount our wing to the fuselage. We can start by taking a barbecue skewer and poking it through these holes on the side of the fuselage. Now let's take some wooden doublers and reinforce these holes. Now that we have our wooden doublers glued in, we can go ahead and take a barbecue skewer, stick it through, and just make it flush with the other side. We'll mark where it is flush on this side as well, and that's where we'll cut. Let's do the same thing for the back, making sure that the back is also flush on both sides. To mount our wings, we're going to need some rubber bands. I have 4 fairly large rubber bands here. You're going to want some wide rubber bands for more support. So what we can do here is loop these rubber bands through the barbecue skewer in the rear. Make sure that this barbecue skewer is all the way through. And we're not going to put the wings on now because we have to do our linkages first, but I'll show you how to mount it for when you're ready. Now when we mount the wing, we're going to notch the leading edge into the front, and the wing should just sit nicely in the cavity. Make sure that this seam in the middle is lined up with the middle of the fuselage. Now we can just take 2 rubber bands and slide them to the right, and the other 2 slide them to the left. And what we're going to do now is actually take this skewer out of the front and hook these rubber bands on. We can pull this skewer with the rubber bands over, and what we're going to do is we're going to slide one side in to our wooden doubler, further out so that the other side can also pop right in. That should secure the wing pretty well, and it shouldn't come apart even in more aggressive 3D maneuvers. Now this part is optional, and it's nice because it allows the wing to be removable. However, if you can transport this in one piece and would rather just glue it on, that's fine as well. Now that you know how to mount the wings, we're going to move on to the tail linkages. For our tail linkages, we're going to need 2 push rods and 2 control horns. So let's start out with the rudder linkage. If you're not doing the optional tail wheel assembly, start by inserting the control horn. The servo arm on the rudder servo should be pointing upwards when the airframe is upright. This way we'll get a straight linkage to our rudder control horn. I'm going to set this airframe up for 3D flying, which means that we need to maximize the amount of torque that our servo outputs to the control surface while getting as much throw as possible. For the rudder, I'm going to go to the second hole in the control horn and the farthest hole out on the servo arm. So I'm going to line this push rod up with the servo arm and just put a 90-degree bend where that meets. And we're just going to do a Z-bend with our pliers. To do a Z-bend, we're going to take the push rod where we marked it and put a 90-degree bend in to one side. Now we're going to take that 90-degree bend, clamp the pliers around it, and do another 90-degree bend in a different direction. And now we can clip this where we want to. Now this is actually a simple Z-bend. It's 90 degrees and then another 90 degrees in another direction. If we want a normal Z-bend, we can simply take this and bend that so it's parallel. Now we can put some glue in the control horn slot and glue it in. You can always follow up with a bead of glue to reinforce this joint. And as always, don't forget to put your servo screw in. Now let's set up our linkage for the elevator, and we're going to do the same exact thing, except we're going to use the most inner hole on the control horn. The elevator servo will also have the servo arm pointing upwards when the plane is upright. Now let's move on to our aileron linkages. Make sure that the servo arms are pointing towards the wingtips. For the ailerons, we're going to use the innermost hole on the control horn and the outermost hole on the servo arm. Next, let's get ready to install our landing gear. The landing gear is optional, so you can leave this smooth on the bottom and just have it as a belly lander if you want. First, what you need to do is connect these dots and cut through them. Now we're going to move on to the wheel pants. The wheel pants are also optional. You don't have to use these with the landing gear. If you're flying off of grass though, I'd recommend that you don't use these because chances are they'll just get torn up. Let's go ahead and remove the foam tabs from this wheel pant. For the wheel pants, we also need to take off the paper from the center strip. Now let's take our foam doublers and glue them to the inside of the wheel pants. Just line it up in the middle so it has about one width of foam around the edge. We're going to need to bend this piece over, so let's go ahead and curve it with our thumbs. Let's go ahead and apply some glue. We're going to just do the top surface, so we're going to apply glue here and on this piece just about to where the tip will meet. and as on the other side as well. Even though there's no glue on the bottom, I'm going to fold this all the way over so that the foam will be pulled nice and taut. We're just going to mark with a razor blade where this ends. Don't cut all the way through because we're going to use the paper on the other side. Now we're just going to apply glue to the inside of the doublers and on the tab. Now we can take this piece that we scored before and peel it off of the paper. We're going to use this paper to seal off the back end of the wheel pan. So to do that, let's just apply a bead of glue on the back and fold it up on the table. When that's dry, we can go ahead and cut off the excess paper. And now we can use the same process to make our second wheel pan. Now that our wheel pans are done, let's go ahead and assemble our wheels. These are the wheels that are included in the kit, but we do carry 2-inch wheels in our store. To put these wheels together, simply put a bead of hot glue around the center and smash them together. Boom. Take your landing gear wire and bend it to shape. We'll start with the axle, and I'm just going to bend it to the width of the wheel pan. Now you'll notice that the wheel pans have these 2 slots cut out on opposing sides. Our next bend is going to be the measurement of that. Let's just eye that length up and bend about 45 degrees outwards. We can take our wire and poke it through the holes on the wheel pan so that this piece right here sits right in that slot. Now we can take our landing gear fairings and slide it over until they meet flush with the wheel pan. So let's mark right where that is and bend the wire 45 degrees upwards. As you can see, there are score cuts in this piece marking where you want the wires to be. Go ahead and lay that flat, mark it, and bend it 90 degrees. For our next bend, we'll bend it right where this other score cut is on the other side. Make sure that this bend and this bend are parallel. Now, we'll just need to cut this wire a little bit shorter, so let's mark where that should be cut. Now, let's repeat the same process on the other wire. Now, as you can see, our second wire will fit inside our second wire. Let's go ahead and mark this wire and cut it. Again, we'll make sure that these 2 wires are parallel. Let's tape these wires before we glue them in to make sure that they're right next to each other. I'm just going to grab a couple pieces of tape and wrap them around the top. This is a good time to check the bend of our wires. Line up the top of the wire with something that you know is straight across and see if these 2 pieces, the axles, line up parallel to this piece right here. We can eyeball where this goes into the foam piece, making sure that the wires exit at about the same point on either side. We can go ahead and mark that. And we'll just put a score cut right where the wires go. You can wind up the score cuts with a barbecue skewer if needed. Before we actually install the wire landing gear into this foam piece, let's remove this foam tab. Let's seat the wire into the grooves we just made and cover that up with the other side of the foam. Just put glue in the grooves that we cut as well as the other areas, and I'm going to go ahead and put some glue on the other side as well. You can make some final adjustments to the landing gear while this is drying. Once the glue is dry, let's make sure that this top part is sealed up nice and tight so that it'll be a good fit in our airframe. To do this, let's take a piece of packing tape and seal up the top. Now let's grab our fuselage and test fit this into the fuselage. When this is all the way in, this piece right here should be flush with the bottom of the fuselage. For the landing gear fairings, let's remove the center strip of foam, this piece of foam over here, and we'll also need to do a bevel on this side. Make this bevel 45 degrees. Now we can install our landing gear fairings. We're just going to put a bead of glue in the center and not the bottom because we don't want this to be connected to the fuselage if we want the landing gear to be removable. So we'll apply a bead of glue in the front and along this side of the fairing. Next, take a scrap piece of foam and we're going to wrap this piece of paper around the landing gear fairing so that's nice and sealed in the front. Let's test fit our wheel on the axle. Good. Right. Next, let's put our wheel pants on. So we just slide that through and that looks like it fits pretty well. Next, we're going to slide on the wheel pant about halfway and then also slide on the wheel at the same time. Let's back this wheel pan out a bit so we can glue it on. Put a bead of glue in the slot and where the fairing attaches. Cool. Now this side of the landing gear is done. Let's repeat the same process on the other side. Now that our landing gear is done, we can put the wing on and program our receiver. Make sure that when you're doing bench testing, don't have a prop on, because if it spins up, that could end badly. Now that our wing's mounted, let's go ahead and program this plane. Since I have the ailerons on separate channels, one in the aileron port and one in the aux1 port, we'll need to program this in our transmitter as dual ailerons. So for Spectrum, you go to System Setup, Aircraft Type, Wing, and then scroll over to Dual Ailerons. And then let's plug it in. So let's check that all of our control surfaces are going in the right direction. So ailerons need to be reversed, elevator's good, and our rudder's good. So let's go ahead and reverse ailerons. For Spectrum, we go to Servo Setup, scroll over to Reverse, and we're going to reverse both our right aileron and our left aileron. Now they're going in the right direction. Next, let's go ahead and use subtrims to center all the surfaces. To do subtrims, this is also in Servo Setup. Scroll over to Subtrim, and we can trim each of the servos so that all of the control surfaces are neutral. Now we can set up some dual rates in Expo. I'm just going to do one rate, so no dual rates, but I will set Expo at 30% for all my surfaces. We can also change our travel adjustment, which will change how far up and down our control surfaces go. On the elevator, that's full up right now. I want a little bit more, so we can go into Servo Setup, Travel, and scroll over to Elevator, and bump that up to a higher number. As you can see, we're getting more elevator throw. We can do the same thing for all our other surfaces. Now that we've done all the setup in the transmitter, we're ready to put a prop on and go fly. The prop I'm using here is a 9x4.5 prop. I like this prop on 4-cell, but you can also use a 10-inch prop on 3-cell. All right, so our prop's on, our canopy's on, we're ready to go fly. I'm flying this right now off of a 4-cell 1300 battery and a 9x4.5 prop. The lighter you keep it, the better it is. So the smaller battery you can use, 1300 is about as small as I would go, just because any smaller and it probably won't be able to deliver as many amps as you need. But a 3-cell 1300 with a 10-inch prop would probably do really well as well. So if you're flying off of grass like I am right now, I recommend not using the wheel pants and just using bigger wheels. Don't try that at home. All right, so that was the Maiden of our FT Edge. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.